We're here today with Lee Child, and I want to start by thanking a very busy author for joining us today. And we're here to talk about Lee's choice, Sophie's Choice, which we were just talking before the broadcast about how much the readers in the book club enjoyed it and how excellent their questions were. Lee, thank you for joining us today.
Really, my pleasure, and I got to say thank you to you for letting me select that book, and especially thank you to your readers for paying such attention to, what was my suggestion. I think it's not an easy book. It's a large, dense, long book, and I'm thrilled that so many people have stuck with it through the weeks.
Great. Let's jump in. We're going to start with a question from Facebook by Sally Haig, who I just have to say was just a wonderful reader throughout and found articles and posted interviews with Styron. So thank you so much for that. It added so much to all of us. She starts with a quote. To produce a mighty book, you must choose a mighty theme. Moby Dick by Herman Melville. And she says, Styron was known for choosing mighty themes. The Holocaust was discussed at length in this novel. Please comment on Styron's choices.
Well, that is a great question. And one of the fantasy questions that I always wonder if anybody will ever ask me is, what is the difference between me and Styron as a writer? And, there's obviously a million differences, but really, at my level, you aim to put in, say, 3 ideas. A book like mine is usually 3 ideas somehow interrelating and making the story. And Sophie's Choice had probably 10 ideas that intertwined to make the story. And obviously, the Holocaust is the central issue, the huge idea, the huge choice. And in a way, it's almost a second-generation Holocaust novel because it was 1979, paperback 1980, so it was a long time after World War II compared to a lot of the earlier literature. So it has a certain kind of balance and a certain kind of perspective that possibly earlier novels didn't have. But I think the simple answer to the question is if you're a serious novelist like Styron was, writing at the time that he was, born in 1925, his lifetime, it's something that you have to do. Sooner or later, you're going to do that. And this was when he thought the time was right.
Yeah. This whole notion of mighty themes, that was something you had mentioned earlier, that contemporary fiction has sort of walked away from the mighty theme. Do you think that's a loss to readers and to literature?
Yeah, I do, kind of. I mean, Martin Amis has done a couple of Holocaust books, including his most recent. So I think the themes are still there, but the patience and the perspective for the long work, because most novels now are of similar length, and they are what we would call normal now, but they would be called short compared to a previous generation of novelists. And I think, in a sense, the themes are still there, but that long, patient examination of them is something that has fallen out of fashion. Why is that? Maybe people feel they don't have the time, they can't devote the attention. Maybe we're in this bite-sized culture now. But certainly the expansiveness, I think, is missing.
Our next question from Laurie Morrison, it also came through via Facebook, follows up on your 10 different novels comment. She says, Mr. Child, you've said that Sophie's Choice is 10 different novels depending on how you sneak up on it. Do you have a favorite theme or framework within which to read and analyze the novel? If so, which of the many themes most resonated with you?
I think looking at it from a purely selfish point of view, the suspense arc. I mean, this is whatever else it is a fantastic suspense novel because we're aware at the beginning that something weird is going on, and we kind of think it's about Sophie. It turns out to be about Sophie and Nathan, and we wait and wait and wait until we find out what it is. And the ultimate reveal, of course, is very late in the book. And so as a suspense novel, it's a masterclass. And the other thing that I love about it is the writer theme. I mean, this is basically a novel about writing a novel, and that informs the whole thing. It's a first-person novel about Stinger, who is a novelist, starting out novelist, as yet completely unsuccessful. So, and that informs the whole thing. Even the voice of the novel is the rather untried and clumsy voice of a first-time novelist. And I also said in the initial interview we did that I think line by line it's not an exceptionally beautiful piece of work, and that because it shouldn't be, it can't be. This is a guy fumbling for his voice, and Styron's self-effacing genius, I think, is he always writes in the voice of the character. There's none of him in this. This is the character. It's his voice. So, and of course, if you've written novels, that's something that you're very experienced with. You know, the clumsiness at first, the ambition, the trepidation about it all, which, if you want to ignore all the fantastic characterization and historical issues, it's still a great novel about being a novelist.
Well, I didn't realize that Laurie Morrison also has the next question, which I just sort of ordered it thematically, and she provided a perfect follow-up to your response. And she seems quite familiar with your work. Did Stingo's description of sitting down to begin writing his novel with a pencil and a pad of paper influence your decision to begin your first novel in a similar manner? And then what about Sophie's Choice influenced your own writing? And I have to say I'm a big fan of your work, and I thought most of it, but I don't know the novel she's referring to. So could you illuminate it?
Yeah, I think she's referring to when I first started writing. I did it on a pencil and paper, and I don't remember being specifically in the front of my mind influenced by that, but I'm sure, yeah, subliminally, the idea that this is a task that you sit down to set out to start, and I wanted to be very much in that old-fashioned tradition where you didn't just buy the toys. You know, you didn't buy yourself a laptop because you were going to write a novel. I wanted to earn it. I wanted to write it on paper, and then if it sold, then I would buy a computer. I wanted it to be real. And so, yeah, that was definitely an influence. Plus, I think in my fifth book, which is called Echo Burning, the bad guys are all living in a house that's painted red. Simply because red was the color that was on special down at the hardware store, and that was a deliberate homage to the pink boarding house in Brooklyn in Sophie's Choice. Oh,
that's wonderful. I will have to go back and reread that one with that in mind. So what can I ask you? Write on a computer or a laptop now?
I write on a computer now. Yeah, I used to. Like I said, the first one was all on paper, and then I typed it into my daughter's computer because I didn't have one. And then I bought a computer, but I thought I would always use that for subsequent drafts, that I ought to write on paper in order not to lose the voice and the style. But that became so inefficient, essentially, that I thought, no, I'll just do it directly into the computer. And it is very interesting, actually, how the two approaches are different approaches. Umberto Eco wrote an essay I read a while ago where he said he bemoaned the fact that fine handwriting was no longer taught in Italian schools. And he didn't like that because he felt that if you are taught to handwrite, then you compose the entire sentence in your head before you put it on paper, which I guess is kind of true. Whereas with computers, with the very easy revision, you are tempted to do it in a completely different way.
It's like taking pictures with a digital camera. You get very promiscuous rather than, remember how carefully you used to film?
You would turn down a picture if it wasn't quite right. Now you take 8 and then you can delete them later.
Yeah, but still cutting and pasting on a computer is a pretty wonderful thing, moving those paragraphs around.
It is, plus just going back and putting in a word, which, you know, that's hard on a handwritten text.
Well, so I mentioned that people really love this novel, but there was some less than strong affection for some of Styron's word choices. And Anthony Skay, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, who's a commenter on WSJ.com, asked, what are Mr. Child's feelings about Styron's frequent use of unusual, arcane, invented words? I was fascinated at first, but further into the story it became a distraction, almost an impediment to the smooth flow of the story.
Well, in principle, I think that's a great point, and there are a lot of novelists who, you could say Anthony Burgess would be one, the aforementioned Martin Amis perhaps another, who use arcane vocabulary. I don't know why, to try and impress us or make us feel, yes, you're immersed in a literary experience now. And I agree, that's an impediment and speed bumps, which I don't like. I didn't feel that about Sophie's Choice. I felt that given he was a fumbling, starting out novelist, some of the clumsiness was valid characterization. I didn't feel that there were gratuitous odd choices just to remind us, hey, I went to college and you didn't, which you get from certain other texts.
And clearly he's someone, both Styron and the narrator, Stinger, are just in love with language, and the exuberance and verbosity is very much a part of who that young man is.
Yeah, exactly. Verbosity is a great word there because it's a torrent. He's just immersed in the flow of words and he loves it. And again, I think, I'm a long way from being Stingo's age, unfortunately, but that's how it was. You were bubbling over with stuff, and I felt it worked as an integral part of the characterization rather than an annoying narrative device.
Okay. Next question from Patricia Kennedy from Facebook. A lot of comments on the WSJ Book Club forum were related to all of Styron's long-winded digressions. Do you think they were necessary, added to our understanding of the story? Were they just showing off?
Well, I think they were definitely not showing off. I think what they were was a feature of a previous age of novel writing. I think that's all you can say. That I think nowadays a novelist sits down to write, and you are sort of allowed to assume certain concessions from the audience. That's part of the deal. And in his generation, they were a different set of concessions, one of which would be, yes, okay, you can have a big, thick book that takes weeks to read, that does digress endlessly. I mean, whole chapters, theoretically, whole chapters here could be cut or abbreviated, and probably would be today. But back then, no, it was permitted, and I think that's part of the joy of reading stuff from the previous generation, which is that you just do. You immerse yourself in this warm bath, and it's a bath that stays warm for weeks, and then you climb out. And nowadays we want a quick shower.
So Sue in Denver, a WSJ commenter, asked, I wonder if any novel so specifically set in time loses readers as it ages. I also wonder if Mr. Child would write books like this if he thought current readers had sufficient attention spans to read them in this day and age.
Well, those are great questions too. Would I don't think I have the talent or the capability to do something this magnificent. And yeah, what was the first half of the question? That did I?
That's the setting it in such a specific time period. Sort of, you somewhat addressed this in your previous question, but do you think it does it lose readers as it ages?
I think not. I mean, because I think you've got to accept with any piece of fiction that it is a snapshot of who the author was at the time, and it's also a snapshot of what the world was at the time. And so I think it is. There are many, many hundreds of novels where you can go back and you certainly can enjoy them as a story, but you also get a flavor of the time. So it's socially realistic at one remove. It tells you about the world at the time the book was written, which I think is, like a double value in effect. It's like reading a piece of social history as well as a piece of fiction.
I couldn't agree more. I think it's a good measure of how something holds up, whether it feels dated. It's interesting. I just reread some Updike, the Rabbit books, and it's fascinating. They're all the discussion is about Nixon. You know, it's just as you say, it's wonderful social history and just a reminder of what was engaging people at the time.
And in my own genre, one of the writers I love best is John D. MacDonald, who wrote crime and thriller set in Florida starting in the early 1960s. And that is eerily prescient about the environmental issues that we face now, 50 years later. He was already worried about that stuff back then. And so you read a book like that and it kind of tells you, no, environmentalism is not a new concern. Actually, a lot of people have been worried about it for ages. And so it expands your knowledge of history as much as anything else.
Yeah. Rita Alexander on Facebook asked, what point is Styron trying to make about guilt? Is it primarily a positive or negative emotion? Does it serve a purpose to make people feel guilty? And if so, in what circumstances is it good to make someone feel guilty?
Well, I mean, I would say in a generic moral sense, it's good to make somebody feel guilty if it is a choice that they can avoid in the future or a mistake they can not make in the future. I think the issue, obviously, with this book, the guilt is just crushing and overwhelming. That obviously she feels guilty afterward. There's nothing she can do about it. She's never going to be in the same situation again, so there's no lesson to be learned. It is just a completely negative, crushing thing that, in fact, ends her life. And so, yeah, guilt is just a horrendous thing here. And if there's any theme surrounding guilt here, possibly it's why doesn't the world in general feel more guilty, or why don't the perpetrators feel more guilty than they apparently do? I mean, don't forget, this book was presumably written over several years in the late 70s, 30 years after World War II ended, and memories were terribly short. 30 years after the war ended, it was all just under the rug. And maybe Styron was saying it shouldn't be.
And that is also, the guilt is one of those great echoing themes, the sort of analogous discussion of slavery and Stingo living sort of off the proceeds of a sold slave from his grandfather's little plantation.
Absolutely.
And
that's a parallel theme, and Nathan, who is suicidal because of mental instability, I think he is a kind of yardstick in the same way that measured against him, Sophie is crippled by the guilt, which is just as bad as and inescapable as Nathan's schizophrenia. There's nothing either one can do about it.
And yet Stingo is very he, through his own view of himself, he's not guilty about the legacy. I mean, he feels badly, but he's very defensive when he's attacked for being a Southerner, and is a big upholder and defender of Southern virtues. And it's more complex and it's more subtle than people appreciate, these broadside attacks. So the whole question of living with guilt is a very complicated one. You have Sophie dealing with it in her way, and Stingo sort of more successfully blocking.
Yeah, I think that the difference being obviously that Sophie's guilty about something she actually did.
Yeah.
Stingo is not guilty about something he didn't do.
Yeah, that's fair. Yes.
He's therefore standing into the audience there, saying, to what extent should we be guilty about things that have happened in the world that we haven't caused? And I think obviously we shouldn't feel guilty about something we didn't do, but we should absolutely feel appreciative of the fact that there's a terrible history back there that still resonates.
Mm-hmm. Good. Jean-Jacques Luce, Facebook, asks, would you comment on how Nathan's character enlivened the story? For me, he was the spark that held my interest over the long haul of the novel. A Nathan fan.
Yeah, quite rightly too. I mean, Nathan is a great character, very well written, very well drawn. And the manic energy, which we initially take, again, I think as a sort of sly nudge towards our own ethnic assumptions. We look at Nathan initially and think, oh yeah, the guy's a New Yorker, or a Jewish New Yorker, in the sense that that hyperactivity, mental restlessness, and so on is a lazy image of how we allegedly live in New York. And so it's a slight dig, are we judging Nathan based on stereotype? But he is, absolutely. He's the live wire. He is the energy of the book, because for a lot of the time, both Stingo and Sophie are suffering from a lack of energy, and therefore we depend on Nathan to power the narrative through. And yeah, the book would be completely inconceivable without him in the way that he is, that in and of himself. And lots of lesser novelists would have just made the novel about Nathan. You know, that's a great subject right there. But in this one, he is the kind of the lightning rod, you know, the thing that the power runs throughout the whole book. So I agree with the questioner there that yeah, he is probably the most fascinating, the most active character anyway. That he's actually doing stuff in the present day that is compelling, whereas the others, Stingo intends to do it in the future, so he has done it in the past. Nathan represents the present.
Oh, fascinating. David Elbert's Facebook asked, "This is undoubtedly the best account I have ever read about life in the concentration camps. Styron's Southern upbringing and Episcopal education. So how was he able to write this account so well?" he wonders.
Because he's a novelist, you know, he's a writer, and that's what we do. We absorb stuff, read it, and then we're, you know, put it back out there on the page. That's and of course, you know, the Holocaust was such a, you know, just such a catastrophic crime and catastrophic ethical horror that possibly fiction is the only way to deal with it. I think, you know, that you could have a case to make that it can only be dealt with through fiction.
Marion Sturr on Facebook asks, and this is a very close reading question, Stingo puts forth a detailed reasoning of how he believes Dr. Neiman came to the place in life where he could thrust the choice upon Sophie. Why might Styron have chosen to do this? It seems so out of sync with the novel. I think, I don't recall, is that the scene on when they're getting off the train and they're you sort of get inside the head of the Nazi doctor on the train side? Yeah,
I'm assuming, and that is again, you know, a novelist taking a stab at something that is fundamentally inexplicable, trying to figure out how did it come to this. And I suppose what he's saying is that absent any kind of restraint whatsoever, legal, moral, ethical, situational, there are no limits, which I think is true. I mean, clearly that is what we understand, that things were completely out of hand with no kind of moral framework whatsoever, and anything was possible. Plus, the scale was so huge. I think it's statistically fair to say everything must have happened. And so, what is the novelist's imperative there? Should he try and boil it down to something that looks more conventionally plausible, or should he embrace the fact that every appalling thing happened, and so he's at liberty to select whatever he wants? And I would side with Styron on that. I think that if you start to kind of self-edit or start to try and explain such things, you are missing the point.
Patricia Kennedy on Facebook asks, why do you suppose that Styron chose not to give a clear picture of Jan and Eva, the children, when so many minor characters were so delineated? The reader, at least this reader, doesn't have a clear understanding of what they were like, Sophie's children.
That's a great point. I mean, that is a really terrific point, which brings us to asking a very fundamental question: are the children just plot devices in order to set up this horrendous scenario that Sophie is living with? And I've often thought about that too. I mean, it's something that is possibly the one weak point in the narrative strategy. Are these just plot devices to set up the dilemma? Or is it possible to say that amongst the millions, these are just anonymous, unregarded people who had no individuality at the time in anybody's eyes, and ultimately was Sophie forced to accept that fact that they had she was asked to look at their own individuality and select, therefore condemning the other one to having no value. Is it a literary device which shows how disposable people were, or is it somehow a thin plot device? And in a lot of ways, criticism-wise, I think that question hits on that is the key thing to examine in this novel. Does it get a bit threadbare there? Should we have known more about them? Or is he trying to communicate that we couldn't bear to know more about them? So we couldn't bear to say anything about them, and Stingo couldn't really bear to contemplate their individuality. So defensive of the novelist's craft, I would say the latter. But I agree with the question. I mean, it's a very perceptive question that I think gets to the heart of what could be regarded as the only weakness.
Well, thank you for that, Patricia Kennedy. Good question. Okay, next question, and from Alyssa Perlman-Taub on Facebook. Styron makes it clear that Sophie had lost all hope after her Holocaust experience. Can Mr. Child talk about how the theme of hope is portrayed and how Sophie's loss of hope distinguishes this from other Holocaust novels?
I don't know. Does it distinguish? I mean, I think that hope after, amongst Holocaust survivors was thin on the ground, in very short supply. I'm trying to think of, again, I don't want to bring in a sort of genre comparison, but if you look at Frederick Forsyth, The Odessa File, which is fundamentally kicked off by a Holocaust survivor who sees one of the perpetrators walking free on the streets of Germany. Now, did he have hope? Yeah, he had hope in the sense of hoping for justice or retribution. And when he couldn't get that to happen, he lost hope. Did Sophie have hope of any kind? No, I don't think she did. I think she was just utterly devastated by it, as were presumably millions of other people. So I think it's the idea that you could get out of a thing like that and rebuild some kind of hope is probably unrealistic, and I think Styron is pretty unflinching about showing that.
Mm-hmm. A question about the movie from Phil Dibble over Facebook. How well do you think the adaptation from book to film worked?
Well, I think, and insiders who know my books and the movie that was made of them are going to probably smile when I say this. I don't think any adaptation is as good as the book. Of all the movies I've ever seen, I can only think of maybe one or two that are, you could say, better than the book. The rest are all worse than the book.
I'm sorry, I have to interrupt there. I want to write down what one or two do you recommend?
Well, I can't say because it'll insult the author if I say that Hollywood was better than.
I will follow up off camera.
I'll follow up privately, but I think the adaptation actually was as good as you could imagine it being. I think an exceptionally strong cast, obviously, and with two of our finest character actors, I think, and it was made faithfully it was not rushed, it was not shoehorned in any way. It unfolded patiently like the book does. So I would say within any basic limitations, it was a fine adaptation.
In our prior conversation about this, you made a very interesting point, and I don't know how many people know that you were a successful television producer in your previous life, and you talked about the difficulty of compressing. And I think Brideshead was the BBC show that you were involved, one of them that you were involved in, and how many how many hours it took to capture that much shorter novel.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, people remember Brideshead as being this long, sprawling saga, and it really isn't. As a novel, it's a fairly short book. You know, it's as short as any sort of modern novel is, 380 odd pages. But even so, to do it justice, it took 13 hours without really leaving out anything at all. So Sophie's Choice would have been probably more like 22, 23 hours to do. And if you were doing it as a television miniseries, I think that's what you would do. But as a movie, of course, let's call it 3 hours at the absolute maximum. You're losing 7/8 of the book's content, and that is a huge ask for the screenwriter. And I think that again, it was done very well.
So, Peg on a Wall Street Journal commenter asked, the main character Stingo was apparently patterned after the author himself, but what about Sophie? Do you know, was she patterned after a real person?
I don't know, and I'm assuming not, because I think that we would have heard, you know, this was a very famous book at the time, and you know, won the NBA for fiction, and it was certainly a major novel. If there had been a real life inspiration, I think we would have heard about it. So I think what it is a but certainly, yes, Styron is remarkably investing himself in Stingo, no question about that. Same birth date, same birthplace, same military experience, same arrival in New York, ambition, all of that kind of stuff. But I think he is inventing Sophie as a composite of the horrors he's read about.
So here's a question from someone that doesn't seem to be quite as enamored of the book. Eileen Mock over Facebook says, my question is more basic. Why does he think this book is so great? Especially to the point of reading multiple times. Many times I almost quit. The idea that there must be some redeeming part coming up kept me reading. So.
Well, obviously that's a completely fair comment. And like I said at the beginning, you know, I'm deeply grateful that people tried it, and I'm extremely happy that so many there apparently enjoyed it, but I am not in the least bit surprised that some didn't, because I think that's absolutely the nature of any book, that there has never been a universally liked book. Yeah. And I think if you gave a book to 10 people, if 7 of them liked it, you would say that is an absolutely overwhelming success. And so it doesn't surprise me at all. And I'm glad that people will say that. I mean, personally, I went through a long time. I mean, it took me a long time to understand that if I didn't enjoy a book, that wasn't my fault. You know, I was sort of brought up and educated in a certain way that made the default situation be that if I wasn't enjoying a book, that was my fault. But no, eventually I had the epiphany, no, maybe it's the book's fault. And yeah, no book can work for everybody. So I'm real perversely happy that she's prepared to say that.
Yeah. So we're winding down. A few more questions. John Falmouth over a Wall Street Journal commenter basically asked, you mentioned if you're only going to read 10 books in your life, make this one of them. And he enjoyed the selection so much, he wonders if you're willing to make public what are the other 9 books could be, or just any other books you want to mention that people should read.
Well, you know, that 10 book, that was a sort of it's a sort of ironic tagline. You know, if I'm ever asked to recommend books, I use that one-liner for Sophie's Choice. I say, if you're only going to read 10 novels in your lifetime, make them Sophie's Choice. In other words, trying to say this is a complex, multi-layered book. In terms of my other top 10 books, I mean, what would have suppose you had said to me, no, we don't want to do Sophie's Choice. What would I have done else? That is, that's one of those questions where we could be on the air for the next 24 hours because there are so many great books, and I'm also very aware of the previous questioner that nobody's going to like them all. So I'm a little bit diffident about recommending the previous great ones. I would say, again, in a kind of if we want to stick basically in this area, I really love and recommend Herman Wouk, the Winds of War and War and Remembrance.
Sure.
Those two books together, which are, people are going to call them pot boilers or whatever, but they are in fact a fabulous history of World War II, told through very accessible fiction. And I guess if you'd said no to me about Sophie's Choice, I might have said that one, simply because it is an absolute potboiler in terms of style, soap opera in terms of character, but it is a magnificently comprehensive history. And I always figure, you know, I was always interested in that subject, and of course I was born relatively shortly after World War II, so it's a lot more contemporary for me. But for instance, if my daughter came to me and said, Dad, you know, I want to understand World War II, what should I read? I would say read the Herman Wouk, Winds of War, War and Remembrance, and you will know everything you need to know.
Great, great. Any thriller writers that you would want to single out, or maybe overlooked ones, or if you are more comfortable, dead ones? Or
let me think. For thriller writing, I mean, the contemporary thriller writers don't need my help.
Yeah.
I like a guy called Jeffrey Household. He had his first book was called Rogue Mail, and it's the basic question is, suppose prior to World War II somebody had assassinated Hitler, and there is somebody. The book opens with somebody trying to do that, and you know, that's a fascinating theme, a fascinating scene to mine, I think.
Okay. Okay, a few more, and these are a couple questions about the end, and this one's kind of poignant. What if Jan was looking for Sophie and found her right before she joined Nathan at the end? Diana Welsh, Facebook. Speaking of alternative histories and alternative endings, sort of.
Yeah, well, exactly. I mean, obviously Siren came to the end of the novel. He has a basic choice. Does he go the full-on Greek tragedy that he actually did, or does he have an intervention which would give us a legitimate but different ending? And for me, the whole weight of the book, this massive crushing weight, points us down one road, and I think that we had to end the way that it did, and I think that was very brave. In fact, the temptation must have been to, you know, not so much a happy ending in the Hollywood sense, but the temptation must have been to lighten it up somehow, or just make it less calamitous than it was. But I think that would have been the wrong choice.
Well, you answered the last question, but I'll read it anyways. And it's, why do you think great writers like Siren and so many readers like me are so much more drawn to tragedies than to stories with happy endings? That's Ann Bachman Hale Smith over Facebook.
Well, yeah, I mean, because fundamentally, I think when we're in the mood, we need something big, heavy, and serious. And I think, yeah, paradoxically, serious, tragic things make for better art than happiness. That's a great, you know, it's a great thing to think about. Suppose we were all happy. Would there be the kind of culture that we have now?
Mm-hmm. Well, Lee Child, thank you so much for bringing this book to our attention. Thank you so much for your time and the care you put into this. We really appreciate it. And if you'll forgive me, one brief commercial for our next book in the book club, which Margaret Atwood chose. It's Earthsea, A Wizard of Earthsea by Ursula Le Guin, which features, it was written in 1968 and has a school for wizards before Harry Potter, and it also has dragons before Game of Thrones. So that's our next book. And Lee Child, thank you so much for your time.
Well, let me just back up your commercial there by saying Le Guin is fantastic, and so is Margaret Atwood, and that right there would have been a great second choice for me, The Handmaid's Tale. You know, that is a terrific novel too. So you've got to. This is a great book club, and so having been the presenter of a book, I might well join in as a participant.
That would be fantastic. Thank you so much, and thank you for all of our good readers out there.
Yeah.